Hey historians, here's your virtual video for today. Maybe you're wondering where I am. Hopefully you can see the water behind me and where could I possibly be? Well, believe it or not, I'm in North Carolina today, and this is a portion of the Great Dismal Swamp Canal Trail. Okay, there's the Great Dismal Swamp, and this trail runs along the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp. The Great Dismal Swamp is a very, very large freshwater swamp that covers part of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. It's actually called the Great Dismal Swamp, great because of its size, meaning it's large. And back when it was named in colonial times, the word dismal meant swamp. So it was originally called the Great Dismal. And now we call it the Great Dismal Swamp, which to a colonial person would be saying the Great Swamp. But that's okay, because we don't know the difference. And it actually is, in some places, somewhat dismal, because it's a swamp and it's dark and it's lots and lots of tight vegetation and lots of insects. And it's really not a very friendly place for human habitation. But one of the very interesting facts about the Great Dismal Swamp is that it became a place during the times of slavery for escaped slaves who had left their, run away from their owners. It gave them a place to hide. And actually there was a slave community within the Great Dismal Swamp. Of escaped slaves that functioned there for a while, in spite of the fact that it's just full of mosquitoes and stinging bugs, and it's a very difficult place for humans to live, but obviously it was better than living as property to another human. So that's part of the story, but this story today is about the Great Dismal Swamp Canal. And in the colonial period, water transportation was the lifeblood of the tidewater areas of Virginia and North Carolina. We call it tidewater because a lot of the rivers and the sounds down in North Carolina are tidally affected. They're affected by salt water moving inland during the high tide and moving out during the low tide. So we call them the tidewater area. Now we call it, in Virginia we call it Hampton Roads. I need to find out what they call it in North Carolina, because I don't know what they call it. Maybe they still call it tidewater. It's a good question, though. So a sound like the Albemarle Sound or the Pamlico Sound is a long, wide body of water that is fed by the ocean, but is surrounded by land. And so during colonial times, you either were traveling in a boat on the water, or maybe a ship, or you were going overland. And you were going overland on horseback, or perhaps in some kind of wagon or other horse-drawn transportation. And a lot of the overland trails were not well maintained. They might be extremely muddy during the rainy season, or they might have fallen trees blocking the way. Various reasons that they could be impassable for transportation reasons, and certainly for shipping. It's not helpful when you can't get down the road. And the other place that they were able to do shipping was off the coast of Carolinas. And the sea off the coast of the Carolinas is pretty treacherous. And it also, besides being geographically difficult to navigate, it's also haunted or plagued with pirates. Certainly we've all heard of Blackbeard, who was an actual real pirate off the coast of North Carolina, who terrorized ships and certainly shipping, because of course they were looking for things to steal, so shipping was great. And like I said, in a storm, the coast of North Carolina can be very dangerous for ships right off the coast. And so in 1763, someone you may have heard of, a surveyor by the name of George Washington, made his first trip to the Great Dismal Swamp. And he suggested that draining part of the swamp and digging a north-south canal through it to connect the waters of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia and the Albemarle Sound in North Carolina would be a great investment for shipping purposes and travel, all kinds of travel. So later, when he was the first president of the United States, he agreed with Virginia's governor, then Patrick Henry, that the canals were the easiest answer for an efficient means of internal transportation, and he urged their creation and improvement along with the cooperation of Patrick Henry and others. So in 1784, the Great Dismal Swamp Canal Company was created, and work was started on the canal itself in 1793. And Washington was one of the investors in the canal company. The canal, believe it or not, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's not small, all right? It's quite wide at this point. It's narrower in other points, but ships need to be able to pass through it, so it can't be that narrow. And every single bit of the canal was dug by hand, by men with shovels. And this canal runs 22 miles. They dug 22 miles of swampy, wet earth out of the way to create this canal. You have to really be amazed at that kind of work and that kind of manpower. The canal was, the labor on the canal, the digging of the canal was mostly done by slaves, usually hired from a nearby landowner. And it took almost 12 years of back-breaking construction under really awful conditions. You all, if you live in anywhere where it gets hot and humid in the summer, like it does here in Tidewater in Chesapeake and in North Carolina as well, you know that the mosquitoes are bad and the humidity is bad and it's hot and it can be just miserable working outdoors in the summer. So it was tough, and they opened the canal after all of that long hard work for 12 years. I'm assuming that it wasn't the same exact people working for all 12 years, but that's how long it took. And it was opened in 1805, and about the same time, the Dismal Swamp Hotel, which was built on the Virginia-North Carolina line. So the hotel sat on the line on the west side of the canal, existed. And it was known at that time, back in the early 1800s, the early 19th century, to be a place to gamble and also to have a tryst with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. It was a great place to go because it was private and kind of out of the way from everywhere. And so in the Great Dismal Swamp Hotel being built over the state line ran through the large dining room in the hotel. So on one side of the room you were in Virginia, and on the other side of the room you were in North Carolina. You're like, so what? Who cares? Well, they would gamble on one side or the other. And that way, if the sheriff showed up and he was a North Carolina sheriff, they could just move over to the other side of the room and they would be out of that North Carolina sheriff's jurisdiction because they would be in Virginia. And the same would be true if they're playing in Virginia. The sheriff shows up, they move their game to the North Carolina side and they say, sorry, Virginia sheriff, we're not in your jurisdiction. So that's just a funny story about what happened with the hotel. The hotel is long gone. There is absolutely no trace of it. So I would love to be able to go there and show it to you, but it no longer exists in any way. But I do want you to just think, we'll talk a little bit more about the slaves that escaped and lived in this very inhospitable place. They were called the Maroons. And people thought they were either crazy or stupid to live there. And most white masters did not want to go into the swamp. Not only it was just a horrible place to try to get into between all the insects and it's a swamp, right? All the mud and also bears lived in this area at that time, so it seemed dangerous to them. And it is said that the escaped slaves would communicate sometimes with slaves who were still in the area, still enslaved, and would talk about how they were pretty sure that the swamp was haunted and there was evil in the swamp. And so it became superstition that the swamp was haunted or the swamp had an evil presence, and that also kept the white slave masters out. So that's the history of the Great Dismal Swamp Canal. In modern times, there is a wonderful paved path that runs all the way down from Virginia to North Carolina. You can get on your bike, or you can walk, or you can run, and you can take this great paved trail along the canal itself. Give you just another view of the canal. It's really peaceful today. It's a beautiful day in November here in Virginia, or in North Carolina actually, because I'm on the North Carolina side of the line today. So that's it for now. So I'll see you next time. Bye for now.